State.
Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Face the State. I'm Tim McGonigal. We're very glad you could be with us today because we have a very special guest. He's now one of our own. If you've picked up a newspaper in the last 30 or so years, you've probably seen his work. You might not know his face, but like I said, you know his work. It's Mike Dennison, the former Capitol reporter for Lee newspapers with the bureau there that recently kind of discontinued, and also for many years before that you were with the Great Falls Tribune. So a lot of folks know you, but they might not know your face. They know your work, and Mike, welcome aboard to the team.
Thanks. It's great to be with MTN. I couldn't be more thrilled to be on board and with an organization that has its reputation and willing to invest in great coverage of the state. And
you're going to be covering the Capitol beat for us. You're going to be the chief Capitol reporter for MTN starting tomorrow and continuing until hopefully a long, long time.
That's right. Yeah, I'll be working with, of course, the viewers know Sanjay Talwani, right, the political correspondent there. I'll be working with him and on the stations across the state. Well,
I briefly talked about your background, but tell us a little bit more about yourself and your journalism background.
Sure. I've been working in Montana, as you said, for about 30 years. I went to University of Montana, where I got a degree in journalism and English in 1981, and almost right out of school, I worked for the Great Falls Tribune here in Great Falls for a couple of years. Then I worked for the Wire Services, UPI, which doesn't exist anymore, and the Associated Press. But for the last 23 years, I've been primarily a political and Capitol reporter, first for the Great Falls Tribune in Helena, and then for Lee newspapers.
Well, you mentioned you went to the University of Montana. That is one of the premier journalism schools, both broadcasting and print. Why do you think it does so well?
That's right. And in fact, when I came to UM to go to school, I transferred from Seattle. I was going to the University of Washington. I didn't even know it had a journalism school. I was in a writing program, and then decided I might want to get a job, and so became a journalist. But it's, as you said, one of the premier small journalism schools in the West. And the reason it's so good, I think, is that they've always taught you, how to do the job. It's not a bunch of, philosophy or concept things. It's how do you write a good story? How do you be fair? How do you cover this? And lots of hands-on work, working for the paper or the TV or radio station there on campus.
All right. You have worked in journalism for many, many years, and you've seen a lot of changes, a lot of politicians who've come and gone. I was trying to think of how many governors have been in office since you've been there. But what would you say, as you've covered this over the years, are some of the more memorable moments, more memorable stories that come to your mind?
Sure, and also we can talk about some of the changes in journalism too. But as far as the stories that I've been involved with and covered, I mean, just hundreds of stories really. But the things that stick out, the coverage of the deregulation of Montana Power Company back in the early 1990s and through that decade. We covered that extensively during my stint at the Tribune, and we were kind of one of the first people on that story and saying, hey, maybe this isn't such a great idea. As it turned out, it was a terrible idea. And I covered that and also other things, a lot of campaigns, including both campaigns of Senator John Tester, both when he beat Conrad Burns and when he held off Dennis Rieberg 6 years later. Two of probably the most exciting campaigns I've ever covered. Millions and millions of dollars being spent down to the wire, and the control of the Senate hanging in the balance. And so lots of campaign stories, and at the legislature as well. I remember the 2007 session when they crashed and burned at the end and did not pass a budget. And then Schweitzer came in and cut a deal with some moderate Republicans, kind of setting the tone for the next really 6 to 8 years of politics in Montana, where we have this split in the Republican Party, which still exists today.
How many legislatures, if you've counted it all up, have you covered?
I think I've covered 11 full-time.
Okay.
And I've been covering the legislature since the late 1980s. And you mentioned governors. I think I've covered 6 governors as well, too.
Yeah. And for journalists, there's no term limits on journalists, so you get to. Do you find yourself when you're at the legislature and meeting with some of those politicians, particularly some of the newer ones, are they kind of maybe asking you for thoughts and advice, or maybe not advice, but just kind of picking your brain since you have been there for such a long time?
That happens once in a while. I mean, there have been occasions where legislators that come up to me and said, Mike, how do I vote on this issue? I'm going, well, you know, I really can't tell you that. You have to decide that. But if you have a question about an issue or about a procedure, you know, I'd be glad to tell you, what I know. But yeah, you do run into, there's not a lot of institutional memory up there anymore because of term limits. And so I'd say there's at least, a third to a half of the legislators who are going to be almost totally new. And it's difficult to figure out what's happening. As a reporter, when you start out, the first session I was there, first couple of sessions, I don't really know what's going on. I mean, and it takes you a while to kind of, follow the path of legislation and know what's going to happen, and just basic procedural stuff.
All right. You mentioned too that there's not only been changes in the legislature, obviously the politicians, they come and they go, but there's changes in journalism too. And when you first started in print journalism, there was, probably there was radio reporters, there were TV reporters, but now you see a lot of online reporters as well, doing their blogging and whatnot. Talk about the evolution of and how social media has kind of helped change things as well. Yeah,
and the internet in general. Yeah. The internet itself has been, absolutely the biggest change since I've been a reporter. It's just changed the whole face of the media, newspapers and TV, radio, everything. It really kind of reduced the revenue stream for a lot of those old-time or traditional media. And what's happened is there are fewer reporters covering politics now and covering the Capitol than when I first started out. There's probably about, I'd say, 2/3 to a half the number of reporters doing it full time. That's one of the biggest changes. And another change that we've seen, you mentioned social media, Twitter, Facebook, ways of communicating, and the internet. And I think the change there primarily is that you have to think, when I go cover something, how fast can I get this up? Like for print reporters, we could think, well, we don't got to worry until 6, 7, 8 o'clock, get our stories done, because it'll be in the paper tomorrow morning. Now, you've got to bang it out now, and you got to get up online, or you've got to tweet it and get it out as fast as you can. So that's definitely a big change too.
Do you think the internet, the social media, is that a good thing for journalism, or do you think it might not be such a good thing for journalism?
Well, I think it's kind of a two-edged sword, really. I mean, it can cut both ways. I mean, what you have to remember is that, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, these are just another way of communicating the story. The story still has to be accurate. It still has to be timely, and it might be shorter, and you might get out some snippets, but those fundamentals are still in place, so it hasn't changed those. And you mentioned before earlier talking about bloggers, and that's come to, we never had that before, where people who are, some of them may have some professional training as journalists, some of them may not. There's probably about a half dozen political bloggers in the state, and they're putting stuff out, but it basically has a spin. And I'll get story ideas from reading those, but they're not professional journalists most of the time. Some of them are professional. You just have to kind of figure out their biases, and once you see a story, and follow it and report it yourself before you just spit it out what they're doing.
All right. Well, there's an upcoming legislature next year. I guess it'll be in 2017,
January.
But what do you foresee for that as we look forward? The Democrats are still trying to. Republicans have the advantage in both houses. The Democrats have the governorship. We'll talk a little bit about the governor's race in a little bit, but do you see Democrats making any inroads, or do you think the Republicans will hang on?
Well, I think Republicans will still control the legislature in 2017. I think Democrats may make some gains. It just kind of depends on who the candidates at the top of the ticket are for governor and for president. In 2016, a presidential year, the turnout is always going to be higher, and that's going to help Democrats. And they have new districts that were tried out for the first time in 2014. The Democrats thought were to their advantage a little bit in some places, but they only made maybe a couple of seats gain. I think you may see a few gains here, so closer margins, but still Republican control. All
right. We've also seen, and I'm sure you saw it too, covering the last legislature and maybe the past couple sessions, we've seen maybe more of what we call, I guess, maybe the moderate Republicans. Are you surprised to see that kind of move? And they've gotten some things done as well. It seems like maybe there's a shift going on within the Republican Party.
And I think that's been going on for quite a while. I mean, I'd say almost a decade. I mean, I can recall when Brian Schweitzer was governor in the 2005 session, when the House was split 50-50 and Democrats controlled the Senate. The only time, not the only time, but one of the times they controlled a House at all in the last 20 years. But Schweitzer was told to get stuff through the House, and he had to peel away, 2, 3, 4 Republicans to form a majority. And I think that's kind of where it began, and it's continued since then, that Democrats have been governor, and they've had to figure ways to get their agenda through somehow, or get parts of their agenda. And to do that, they have to have some Republican help. And they've been aided by, I think, conservative Republicans have been trying to kind of purge some of their members, and those members have rebelled and said, we're going to fight back, and we're going to team up with Democrats sometimes, and we're going to drive the agenda, not you.
Right, we kind of saw that with Medicaid expansion. A
Absolutely.
couple of years ago, it failed, but this time around, there was a little bit of a compromise and more of a meeting in the middle.
Yeah, and we had a couple other issues too as well. Of course, the major campaign finance reform bill, the Flathead Water Compact, that conservatives very much opposed to them, but they could not stop those because some of the more moderate Republicans teamed up with the Democrats to get those through.
All right. Well, we talked a little bit about the legislature and the upcoming elections there. Big race for governor will be coming up. Governor Steve Bullock hoping to hang on to his seat there, and there's been talk that Bozeman businessman Greg Gianforte is going to be running as well. What, as you look ahead to that potential matchup, because they both have to get through the primaries, but
yeah.
What do you see if those two?
Yeah, let's assume that they are going to run against each other. I think it's, I don't know yet, a fairly safe assumption, it looks like at this point. Bullock, Governor Bullock, a Democrat, I haven't seen any independent polls of note, but I assume he's pretty popular. He's a very likable guy. He's had success at the legislature 2 times in a row. Hasn't really screwed anything up. The budget's in good shape. I think he's going to be very tough to beat no matter who runs against him. And the Republicans don't really have a prominent person. Gianforte, well, he's been out there. I think the public at large doesn't know a lot about him, so it's going to be up to him to really ramp up just the voter recognition to find out who he is. And that's where the battle, I think, is going to be initially. The Democrats are going to try to take that issue and say, we'll tell you who this guy is, and it's not good. And Gianforte is going to be saying, well, wait a minute, here's what I've done that's good. And he's going to try to get that image out there, and from there, we'll see what happens. He
has been a very successful businessman, and so he'll probably use that to his advantage. And he does have some money behind him, from what we understand. So
that's right. He's probably one of the wealthiest people in Montana. He and his wife together started the company Right Now Technologies in Bozeman, which is a software company, a customer service software company that was hugely successful and employed hundreds of people and basically had an international reach when they sold it to Oracle for $1.8 billion several years ago. So it made a lot of money off that, and he's used that to go around and talk about how to start businesses, and used his expertise in the tech field to talk about starting businesses here in Montana that are high-tech businesses.
Okay. You mentioned Brian Schweitzer. He was Steve Bullock's predecessor, and you had a chance, obviously, to work with him. I know for our on our broadcast side, working with him, he was always good for a great soundbite. Did you find that true for the newspaper side as well?
Yeah. The thing we used to see about Schweitzer is that no matter what he's doing, you know it's going to be entertaining. and he was unlike any governor that I've covered. Most governors that I had covered, you would try to talk to them and call them up and arrange something, and they weren't hiding from you, but they just kind of kept their distance from the press. Schweitzer, he just call you up on the phone and just say, this is Brian, and just start talking about something you'd cover that day or that week, and just start jawing. And he just loved the spotlight and loved talking to the press, and he was like no other in that regard. And just kind of a born entertainer, really.
All right. Well, one of the people that you worked with for a long time, who was also a member of that Lee Bureau, was Chuck Johnson, who I believe covered the Constitutional Convention in 1972.
That's right.
So he was there even longer than you. But I know you learned a lot from him, and you guys are still great friends. What do you think? If you look back at what Chuck taught you, or maybe what you might have learned from watching him, working alongside him, what kind of stands out? Yeah,
well, and also I should say that without Chuck Johnson, I probably wouldn't have a career in journalism. He's various things that helped me get jobs or helped my wife get jobs over the years. And he's been a friend and colleague. But you know, Chuck Johnson was a guy who you know, really set the standard of fairness and treating everyone equally. I mean, I know that Republicans and Democrats alike had offered him jobs because they just they never really knew where he stood politically on many things. And plus, I think Chuck was just a great conversationalist, or is a great conversationalist. I shouldn't say was; he's still around, and made people feel at ease when he talked to them, and you know, just never threatening, and just had a real demeanor about him that I think that any journalist could emulate, and find they can get quite a ways in the business being that way.
All right. When you and Chuck found out that Lee Newspapers was discontinuing their bureau, what were your thoughts? Because here you guys have a lot of experience, and this is an important. Montana might not be a big state population-wise, but still people want to find out this information, and you two are two of the mainstays. And I guess what went through your mind when you?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I wasn't that surprised that they wanted to downsize that operation, just because the company itself had, you know, not been in the greatest financial shape. Print journalism's been in tough shape. So that didn't catch me totally by surprise. What was surprising to me is that they would close the bureau entirely, rather than maybe taking it down to one person. Because I think people in Montana, you know, they do follow politics because they're so close to the people that represent them. They see them on the street, they see them in the grocery store. They want to know what's going on. And every paper that I've worked at in Montana, political news, legislative news, has been played prominently because people like to read it and know what's going on.
Well, I know you can't tell us what you're working on right now, but I know that there's a lot of issues that are going to be coming up here as you're going to be our capital reporter for MTN. But what do you foresee as some of the big issues coming up in the next couple of years, I guess, as we get closer to the legislature and the election cycle?
Yeah, certainly. I think, you know, the Medicaid expansion you mentioned earlier in the show, that's going to be a big issue, just rolling it out. And you know, this is hundreds of millions of dollars coming into the state, covering anywhere from, you know, 20 to 50,000 more people in the state. How is that going to work? Will the federal government accept the model that Montana wants to do? That's going to be a big issue. Also, we mentioned the campaign finance reform. Montana has probably one of the newest type of efforts and laws to control that, put more spotlight on dark money. How is that going to work out? That's going to be a big story. You mentioned the governor's race, and I think we also may see some spirited Supreme Court races as conservatives try to get more control of the Supreme Court in Montana. And also, I think really the big political story in Montana is the continued tension between Democrats and Republicans. It's a very closely divided state, although conservatives seem to have the upper hand, but they still can't really seem to control majorities. They're going to keep trying to do that in some fashion.
You mentioned it's a kind of a tense time between those two parties, and they've always been kind of on opposite sides, kind of competing, I guess. But has it changed? Have you seen the parties change as like from when you first started? Maybe more cooperation. They're always going to have differences, but you like to see that cooperation. I think the citizens like to see that cooperation, but sometimes it seems like there's no give and take on each side.
I think you're right. The people of Montana do want their politicians to work together because the state is fairly closely divided politically, and what I've seen is that I think it's become a little more partisan than it has. It's always been partisan. Democrats are always trying to get one up on Republicans and vice versa, but now I think that there is a more conservative strain that's developed within the GOP, and they say that we represent our party in Montana, and we want to control the agenda and make Montana a more conservative state. And that tension is going to continue, I think, and it's the Republicans are going to have to try to sort that out, and Democrats are going to try to take advantage of it and still win things, even with their minority status.
Right. I found it interesting, too, reading some of the comments when you and Chuck and the Bureau was downsized. Some of the comments from people not happy with that decision, but also thanking you and appreciating all the work that you've done. And that's got to make you feel good as a journalist because you've got it coming from both sides, both Republicans, Democrats, and tell me your thoughts on some of the things you heard, and maybe some that might have surprised you as well.
Well, that was really nice to hear from both sides, and it didn't really surprise me in that, because I said Chuck Johnson and I prided ourselves in treating people fairly, and one thing that I've always done as a reporter, when I'm talking to people and I come up and say, okay, I want to do a story on this, I always tell them exactly what the story is, what it's about, who I've talked to, where I'm going with it, totally upfront about what it is. I don't want any surprises from them when they pick up the paper or they watch TV the next day. And I think that's really kind of where the appreciation comes from, that if you be upfront with people and treat them fairly, and when they pick up the paper or watch the news and say, yeah, that is what I said, that is accurate, and that's what I want to see.
Have you ever had anybody who you've tried to interview that refuses to do the interview because they might have maybe a distrust of the press, or has that ever happened?
Oh yeah, I think more often it's people who aren't used to dealing with the press. And as a saying, you have to talk them down from the tree and say, look, here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm talking to you. If you don't talk to me, here's what will happen. Well, the story without your comment, and I'd say 9 times out of 10, you can get them to talk to you.
All right. What would you say to young people who are thinking about getting into journalism, be it print or broadcast? What's your advice, knowing what you know now is what you knew back in '81?
Well, I think they'd have to think about just what sort of niche they want to fill, and where's the press and the media going right now in terms of what, where is TV news, where is print news going, and how do you fit into that? Because it's a changing world, and it's changing faster than I can even determine myself and know what to do. And I guess I would say that you got to develop your skills as any other journalist would, and be a good writer and be a good communicator and be able to work fast and be adaptable, which really isn't any different from what I learned 30, 35 years ago.
All right. We talked a little bit about Brian Schweitzer. We've talked a little bit about Steve Bullock, two very different personalities. But talk about maybe some of the other governors and maybe some of the other personalities that you've come across in state government that maybe stand out in your mind. Well,
of course, Senator Max Baucus, Senator Conrad Burns, two very different people. I mean, Senator Baucus, he basically wrote his staff, and he wrote the health care reform bill. And he was involved in almost every major issue you could think of for the last 20 years in some fashion, and never lost an election. And even though he was not the most articulate guy, I mean, he was not like Schweitzer and Burns, who are just, these guys are just kind of jokers and very, very easy to talk to. Baucus was not like that, but still, look what he did. I mean, he was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And the same thing, Conrad Burns was, he was a fascinating guy to cover as well. He always kind of, I think he felt the press was kind of hard on him. And in some ways, I think he was right. But still, he came from the media, and he worked well with us, and he was involved in lots of big issues as well. So, those two guys probably stand out just off the top of my head.
Any maybe state legislators that kind of jump out at you?
Yeah, there were a few. Senator John Cobb, who's from Augusta, kind of a different guy who would go both sides of the fence, and just a really super smart guy, knew state government in and out. I think he was a great cover. Francis Bardino, the late Francis Bardino, who was from up on the High Line, just a wonderful guy who saw the legislature from the 1950s into the 1990s, and people like that. Those are the two that come to mind. There's other ones that I've covered. I mean, there's very few legislators that I've covered that I have even disliked. All these people, I think, are smart and engaging and want to do the right thing.
All right. How about the legislative sessions themselves? I know that there's been some real unique times in the legislature and debates that have gone on, and I think you mentioned in 2007. That was a time. Any other moments in the legislature that kind of stand out in your mind?
I mentioned Francis Bardino.
Sure.
I mean, this is quite a while ago. In the late 80s, though, they had a special session that went late into the night on the Saturday before Easter, went into Easter morning, like 2 or 3 in the morning. Here's Francis Bardino on the floor of the House just shouting at this Republican saying, "You've crucified the rights of the voters on Easter Sunday morning." And of course, none of that was up in the paper until like a day later, because there was no instant news, as it were, and things like that.
So these days that could be up instantly, and with the Twitter, with the Facebook, that sort of thing. And
if people were still watching that at 2 in the morning.
Yeah, that's true.
But they would see it the next morning rather than a day later.
All right. How long do you think you'll do this? You're still a fairly young guy, but how long do you want to continue to do this?
Well, you know, at least another 5 years, I would hope. And I've kind of looked ahead to the elections. 2020, 2022 may be the last elections that I cover. And I may cover a few more legislatures, but it's still something that fascinates me. I love telling the stories about what's going on, and what I like even more is being able to take a complex issue and break it down and explain it to people and say, here's why you should care. Because if you just cover the process and say, you know, so-and-so voted this way, so-and-so committee did that, you know, that doesn't mean anything to people. You got to tell them, you know, what it means to them and why they should care.
Yeah, and we're looking forward to you doing that for us. We didn't talk about the U.S. House race, which will be coming up. Ryan Zinke is the incumbent there, and have you heard of any possible candidates who might be running against him or running on the Democratic side?
I've not really. You know, one name that has come up is Dirk Adams, who ran, a rancher from Wilsall, who ran for the U.S. Senate last year, but I've not spoken to him. I don't know if he's considering it. What most people are thinking about is, will Ryan Zinke take on John Tester in 2018? Of course, he still has to win next year, but I haven't heard any prominent Democrat being mentioned, so Zinke must be feeling pretty good about that right now. How
about some of maybe the other up-and-comers in both parties, the Democratic and Republican Party, maybe in the legislature, who might be looking forward to a higher political calling, either as a U.S. representative or maybe running for Senate when that time comes? Is there anybody that jumps out at you?
You know, I haven't heard of anyone. Of course, we have, you know, Jesse Lazovich, who's running for, I believe, state auditor. I mean, you know, he's a fairly young man, and is I would think that he'd probably have his sights on something down the road. But as far as Congress and some of those races and legislators, there may be fewer thinking about it, but you know, a legislator, I think, you know, they really don't have much name recognition outside even in their own district. People may not know who they are. And so, you know, I think the bench is kind of thin in that regard, and people need to be almost like a statewide office holder before they can kind of think of launching into that arena. It has happened before, but right at this point, I don't think there's a lot of people I would name off the top of my head.
All right, well, Mike Dennison, our new state capitol reporter for the Montana Television Network, MTN, we're very glad to have you on board, and you start full-time officially on the job tomorrow.
That's right.
And so we're looking forward to you having you here, and we certainly appreciate you taking time to talk to us.
Thanks, Tim, and I'm looking forward to it just as much as you are.
All right, thanks a lot, Mike.
Thanks.
Great talking with you. We thank you for joining in this morning, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.